The village of Kano was already burning when Dara understood he had lost. Not the moment the first hut caught fire. Not when the screaming started at the eastern border where the attackers broke through. He understood it earlier than that, in the breath between one heartbeat and the next, standing in the middle of the village square with a blade in each hand and bodies already on the ground around him. When he counted the enemy still coming through the tree line and compared that number to the men he had left standing beside him. The numbers did not balance. They had never balanced. He had known that for weeks. He fought anyway. The first man who reached him swung a heavy iron club at his head. Dara stepped inside the swing, let it pass his ear close enough to feel the air move, and drove his elbow into the man's jaw with the precise force of someone who has studied exactly where a jaw breaks. The man dropped before his club finished its arc. The second and third came together, the way trained soldiers do, covering each other's angles. Dara read their approach in the half-second before they committed to it, shifted his weight to the left, let the right man's spear slide past his ribs, caught the shaft and turned it back across the left man's throat in one continuous motion. Both went down, for more were already coming. Behind him a woman screamed, then stopped screaming. A child ran across the square with fire catching on the edge of his cloth wrap, and an older boy tackled him to the ground, rolling him, putting the fire out with his bare hands. Somewhere in the chaos, a man was shouting orders that nobody was following anymore because the men he was shouting at were already gone. Dara defeated the next 4, and the 4 after that. It made no difference, because for every man he put on the ground, 3 more came through the tree line, and the village of Kano had no walls, no fortifications, nothing between its people and the open forest that surrounded it on every side. He had told them that. He had told them exactly this. Standing in this same square weeks before any of this began, pointing at the tree line and explaining in plain language what would come through it and when. They had listened politely and done nothing. He kept fighting until the last man beside him was gone, until the huts around the square were all burning and there was nobody left to protect. Some of the attackers had pushed past him toward the far end of the village where the surviving villagers were being rounded up and bound. Then he stopped. He stood in the burning square of Kano with blood on his hands and ash falling around him like black snow and understood, with a clarity that felt like something breaking in his chest, that he had failed again. With no options left for him, he escaped the chaos. Ran out of Kano through the western path, the one that led away from the enemy's approach, the only direction that was still clear. There was nothing behind him worth saving anymore. He walked until the sound of Kano faded and the darkness of the forest swallowed everything, and then he kept walking, to understand how a man arrives at that moment. Standing in burning ashes, watching the second community he tried to save destroyed in front of him. We have to go back. Before Kano, before the kingdoms he served and left, before the wandering, back to where Dara began. His master's name was Son. Son was not a king or a general, not the kind of man whose name appeared in the stories kingdoms tell about themselves. Son lived in a structure so old nobody remembered who built it, at the edge of a forest in the borderlands between 3 kingdoms that had spent generations trying to decide whether the land he occupied belonged to any of them. He called it nothing in particular. Those who had trained there and left called it the only place they had ever learned anything real. Dara arrived at 12 years old, sent by a father who had recognized something in his son that he could not train himself. An observation, a quality of attention that went beyond what childhood should carry. His father was a soldier, a good one, who understood enough to know that what lived in Dara needed a different kind of sharpening than he could offer. Son looked at the boy for a long time when he arrived. Then he pointed at a spot on the ground and told him to sit. Dara sat. Son said nothing for the rest of that day. He moved around his compound doing ordinary things, grinding grain, repairing a tool, tending a small fire. Dara sat and watched and did not speak because something told him, with the same instinct that had always lived in him, that this was already the lesson. That evening Son sat across from him and asked one question. "What did you notice today?" Dara told him everything. The way Son's left hand favored certain tasks over his right, suggesting an old injury. The way he always positioned himself with a clear line of sight to the compound entrance. The way his breathing changed slightly when he passed the eastern corner of the structure. Something about that corner made him cautious, though nothing visible explained why. The way he had watched Dara for half the morning from a position Dara was only supposed to think was out of sight. Son was quiet for a while after that. The training lasted 6 years. Not combat first, that came later and almost felt secondary to everything that preceded it. What Son taught in the early years was perception. The discipline of truly seeing what stood in front of you rather than what you expected or wanted to see. He taught Dara to read a person's history in the way they held their body, to hear the lie beneath the words by tracking the small physical signals the body cannot discipline the way the voice can. He taught him that every structure, a hut, a kingdom, a relationship between two people, an army's formation, carries within it the precise point where it will break under enough pressure, and that point can always be found if you are willing to look carefully enough. He taught him that the difference between a man who wins a fight and a man who wins a war is the difference between strength and understanding. Strength defeats the man in front of you. Understanding defeats the army he belongs to before it ever arrives. Combat came after all of that, and when it came, it was built on everything Son had laid before it. Every strike placed at the exact point of weakness, every defense reading the attacker's intention before the attacker had fully formed it himself. Dara's body became an extension of his perception, precise and efficient in a way that had nothing to do with size or power. By the time he was 18 and left the compound, Son said only one thing to him at the entrance. "You see clearly. The burden of that is that you will spend your life among people who don't. Be patient with them." Dara thought he understood what that meant. He spent the next several years learning how completely he had underestimated it. The first army he served was called the Gamba, a force belonging to a powerful eastern kingdom whose military reputation stretched across 3 territories. They recruited Dara after he was observed in a border conflict where he had walked into the middle of a standoff between 20 armed men and talked both sides out of it without anything more than words and a precise understanding of what each side actually feared losing. The Gamba commander who recruited him said he had never seen anything like it. Dara served the Gamba for 3 years, long enough to understand it completely, long enough to see the fractures running through its command structure, the jealousy between senior officers, the information being sold to rival kingdoms by 2 men among the chief's council, the king's growing detachment from the reality of what his army was actually doing in his name at the borders. He reported what he saw to the people who should have acted on it. Nothing changed. The information disappeared into the same silence that warnings always disappeared into when they threatened the comfort of men in power. And Dara understood, with the particular clarity that was both his gift and his heaviest burden, that nothing about this was going to change. The Gamba was not corrupt because of bad men. It was corrupt because the structure itself had been built in a way that made corruption inevitable, and nobody with the power to change the structure had any reason to want it changed. He left without ceremony. No dramatic departure, no confrontation, no farewell speech. He simply stopped being there one morning. The Second Army found him before he found them. The Khasa were the military force of a Western kingdom considerably more powerful than the Gamba, better organized, better funded, and led by a general named Amadi who was genuinely one of the most tactically gifted soldiers Dara had ever encountered. Dara stayed with the Khasa for 2 years because Amadi was worth learning from and because for the first time he felt something close to genuine respect for the structure he was operating inside. But the Khasa's king was a different matter entirely. Where Amadi was sharp and principled, the king was the kind of man who had inherited power without ever developing the character to carry it properly, vain, suspicious of anyone who showed too much competence, quick to take credit for successes and redistribute blame for failures with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it since birth. Dara watched the king slowly undermine Amadi over the course of 2 years, not dramatically, not in any single decisive confrontation, but in the patient grinding way that insecure power always works against genuine ability. By the time Dara left the Khasa, Amadi was still technically the general, but the actual shape of his authority had been hollowed out so completely it was barely a title anymore. The Khasa would collapse within 5 years. Dara saw it as clearly as he saw everything else and felt the familiar weight of knowing something that nobody around him wanted to hear. He walked west. He found Kano on an unmarked path that wasn't on any map he had ever seen. which told him immediately that it was either very new or had survived for a long time by not being found. The true fact of her survival had been that it had survived for a long time by not being found. The village sat in a shallow valley between two hills, invisible from any of the surrounding roads, accessible only by narrow paths through dense forest that a traveler would have to know were there in order to find them. The people of Kano were farmers and craftsmen. Good, quiet people who had built something genuine in the space the world had forgotten to pay attention to. Dara stopped there for water and stayed for 6 months. Not because he planned to, but because the people of Kano were the first community he had encountered in years that reminded him of what he had been trying to protect all along. There was something in the way they treated each other, an ease, a generosity, a collective understanding that what was good for one household was good for all of them, that Dara had stopped believing still existed anywhere. He also saw, from the first day he walked the perimeter of the valley, that Kano was sitting on borrowed time. The hills that hid it were also a trap. An enemy approaching from the north could reach the valley floor before anyone in the village had time to organize a response. The forest paths that kept Kano hidden from travelers also kept it hidden from potential allies. And in the three kingdoms whose borderlands surrounded Kano's valley, a territorial dispute had been building for the past 2 years that was going to end in military movement, and when armies moved through borderlands they swept everything in their path. He tried to explain this to the village elders. They listened with the patient courtesy of people who had survived for generations by trusting what they knew and distrusting what they didn't. What they knew was this valley, these hills, these paths that nobody found. What Dara was telling them required them to believe that the safety they had built their entire lives on was actually a weakness in disguise, and that was too large a thing to accept from a stranger who had been among them for only a few weeks. He stayed and trained their young men as best he could in the time available. He organized watches on the hill paths. He sent word through traders to neighboring villages about the territorial movements he was tracking. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The attack came on a morning when the mist was still thick in the valley, which was exactly when Dara had predicted it would come, because the mist was the one condition that neutralized the hilltop watch advantage he had tried to create. He was already awake, already moving, already at the eastern path when the first attackers came through it. He fought from the eastern path to the village square and held that ground longer than any 10 men should have been able to hold it. Kano fell anyway. He walked for a long time after Kano. Weeks of moving without purpose or direction, letting distance pile up between himself and the valley's ashes, eating what the forest offered and sleeping on ground that was hard and cold and completely without comfort. The walking was not healing. It was simply what a man does when he had no direction of where he is going and there is nowhere particular to go. Eventually, the walking led him to the kingdom of Burrow. He did not choose Burrow for any strategic reason. He arrived at its border exhausted and carrying 2 failures that had settled into his bones like old injuries, and the kingdom simply represented the next thing in front of him. Its military was strong, the largest force he had encountered in this part of the continent. And for a man who had twice watched communities he cared about destroyed by inadequate defense, the appeal of genuine military scale was straightforward. He offered his service. They accepted quickly because men like Dara are recognized by anyone with a serious military eye, regardless of whether they can fully explain what they are recognizing. He rose through Burrow's ranks faster than he wanted to. He had not come to lead. He had come to serve, to be one layer of genuine strength inside something large enough to actually protect what needed protecting. But perception is difficult to hide when you are surrounded by people who make decisions based on significantly less of it. And within a year Dara was sitting and planning meetings that his rank technically did not entitle him to attend, because the commanders who ran those meetings had quietly realized that the outcomes were better when he was in the room. The closer he got to Burrow's center of power, the more clearly he saw what lived there. The council that surrounded the king was not a council in any meaningful sense. It was a collection of arrangements, each man in it maintaining his position through a web of debts, threats, favors, and private alliances that had more to do with the neighboring enemy kingdoms than with Burrow itself. Dara watched it the way he had been taught to watch everything, without assumptions, without rushing to conclusions, simply accumulating what was actually there until the picture assembled itself completely. What assembled itself was a picture of a kingdom being slowly hollowed out by the very men charged with its protection. He watched for months before he moved. He needed to be certain, not about what was happening, which was clear early on, but about which men were fully committed to the betrayal and which were simply compromised by it. The distinction mattered because the king would need to know not just that his counsel was rotten, but exactly how rotten and exactly where the rot began. When he was certain, he went to the king. The meeting lasted less time than Dara expected. He laid everything out with the methodical precision that Son had trained into him over 6 years. Not dramatically, not with the urgency that fear might have produced, but clearly and in sequence, giving the king every piece of evidence in the order that made it most impossible to dismiss. Names, patterns, the specific movements of information from Burrow's planning rooms to the ears of men in enemy courts. The timeline of how long it had been happening and how deep it now ran. The king listened to all of it. Then he told Dara he was a talented soldier with an ambitious imagination and that his concerns, while noted, reflected a misunderstanding of how council relationships actually functioned at this level of governance. He told him that the men Dara was describing had served Burrow for decades with distinction, and that the kind of cynicism that saw betrayal in every relationship was a limitation, not a gift. He was not angry. That was almost worse. The calm, absolute certainty of a man who had already decided what the truth was and experienced any contradiction of it as simply a failure of understanding on the other person's part. Dara left the meeting and stood outside the palace for a long time. He had been here before. Not in this palace, not with this king, but in this exact moment. The moment after the warning that nobody wanted. The moment where the only choices remaining were to stay and watch the collapse happen or to leave before it consumed him along with everything else. He went back to his quarters, gathered what he owned, and walked out of Burrow the same way he had walked into it. Alone, without ceremony, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who sees clearly in a world that consistently prefers not to. He had no destination when he left Burrow. He moved west because west was the direction he had not yet fully traveled, and because a man without a destination might as well choose direction by the simplest logic available to him. He passed through small kingdoms and large ones, through trading cities and border villages, through places that were thriving and places that were quietly dying in ways their inhabitants had not yet fully registered. He did not stop anywhere long enough to matter. Until the kingdom of Epha. He almost missed it. Epha did not announce itself the way kingdoms usually did. No heavy military presence at the borders, no imposing gates, no clear demonstration of power meant to communicate to approaching travelers exactly what kind of place this was. The border was simply a wooden post carved with a symbol he did not recognize, standing at the point where one stretch of road became slightly better maintained than the one behind it. The difference in the road was what made him look up and actually see where he was. He entered Epha expecting to pass through it in a day. Within an hour, he had noticed 3 things that made him slow down. The first was the people. Not their faces or their clothing, but their manner. The unhurried quality of how they moved through their day. The way conversations happened between strangers in the market with the ease of people who did not carry chronic low-level fear of each other. In every kingdom Dara had ever been, he had learned to read the background anxiety of a population the way Son had taught him to read everything else. In most places it was always there. A tightness, a guardedness, the slight calculation that happens in every social interaction when people are not completely sure of their safety. In Epha it was absent. The second thing was King Obesai himself, whom Dara observed from a distance in the market without knowing initially who he was. A broad, unhurried man in clothing no more elaborate than any of the traders around him, moving through the crowd without guards, stopping to speak with people the way a neighbor speaks with neighbors rather than the way power speaks with subjects. The third thing was the military, or rather, the near-complete absence of any meaningful military. A few guards, ceremonial in posture and equipment, positioned at points that suggested someone had once read about how kingdoms were supposed to look rather than studied how they were actually supposed to function. No training grounds that he could identify from where he stood. No organized defensive positioning in the architecture of the settlement. Epha was the most genuinely content community he had encountered since Kano. And like Kano, it had almost no real protection. He sat down at the edge of the market and thought about that for a long time. He met Simi on his 3rd day in Epha. She was not looking for conversation and neither was he. Both of them reaching for the same bunch of herbs at a market stall at the same moment. The minor collision of two people occupying the same space without noticing each other until it was too late to avoid it gracefully. She laughed at the collision. Not a polite laugh, a genuine one, the kind that meant she found the situation actually funny rather than simply requiring a social response. He found himself without the usual words he deployed in these moments, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. She asked him where he was from, and he gave her the honest answer, which was complicated, and instead of the polite loss of interest that complicated honest answers usually produced, she leaned on the stall and asked him to explain what he meant by that. They talked for longer than either of them had planned. By the end of the conversation, she knew more about him than most people learned in months of acquaintance, which told him something about her that he filed away carefully. She was not easily fooled. She had simply decided he was worth knowing and applied herself to the task directly. He came back to the market the following day, and the day after that. The months that followed were unlike anything in Dara's life before them. He settled into Epha with the deliberate simplicity of a man who has decided to try something his entire previous life had not allowed. A small home, work that used his hands rather than his mind. Evenings with Simi that became the fixed point around which the rest of his time organized itself. The people of Epha accepted him with the same uncomplicated generosity they extended to everything. He was here, he was decent, he was therefore part of the place. He trained a small group of young men in the mornings. Quietly, without making it official, presenting it as exercise and discipline rather than what it actually was. A man who could not fully stop watching the border that nobody else seemed concerned about, doing the only thing available to him. King Obesai noticed and said nothing about it for months. Then one afternoon he appeared at the edge of the training ground, watched for a while, and when Dara met his eyes, simply nodded with the expression of a man who appreciated something without needing to discuss it. Dara had served two kings who said much and meant little. This one said nothing and meant everything. Time passed the way it only passes when a person has finally stopped fighting against where they are. Seasons changed. His household with Simi grew as they now had two children. The young men he trained in the mornings became something closer to a real unit. Not an army, not nearly, but men who could respond to a threat with something other than pure panic. He stopped looking at the border every morning. Almost. It was a trader passing through Epha on his way from the northern territories who said the thing that made Dara froze for a moment. Not a dramatic thing. Not a warning or a declaration of any kind. Just a piece of market conversation, the kind that happens between travelers and locals in a dozen exchanges a day. The trader mentioning, as a casual aside about conditions on the northern road, that military movement in the borderlands had picked up significantly in the past few weeks. Supply lines being established. Camps appearing in positions that suggested something more permanent than a patrol. Nobody else in the market paid particular attention. Dara heard it and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. He knew this pattern. He had seen it twice before, the quiet preliminary movements that happen weeks before an attack, the logistical preparations that look like nothing in particular until you understand what they are preparations for. He had seen it before Kano. He had seen it in Burroughs' borderlands before he left. He stood in the middle of the Epha market and looked around at the people moving through their unhurried day, at Simi 3 stalls away laughing at something a cloth seller had said, at the ceremonial guards leaning on their decorative spears, at the beautiful, undefended, deeply contented kingdom that had no idea what was being assembled in the hills to the north of it. He had been here before. The question was what he was going to do about it this time. He walked home through the market without stopping. The trader's words were still moving through him the way cold water moves through the body. Felt everywhere at once, impossible to ignore. He kept his pace steady and his face neutral because that was what years of training produced even when everything underneath was already running at full speed. When he pushed open the door of his home, his youngest was the first thing he saw. Sitting on the floor with a carved wooden animal in each hand, narrating something to himself in the half-language of a child who has not yet decided which words belong to which things. The boy looked up when Dara entered and held both animals out as a form of greeting, which was his way. Dara sat on the floor beside him and looked at his son's face for a moment longer than usual. Simi came from the back of the house and he saw immediately from the way she was carrying herself that something had shifted in her. a particular quality of stillness, the kind that surrounds news before it is spoken. She sat across from him and looked at him with the directness that had been the first thing he noticed about her in the market years ago. She told him she was pregnant. He did not speak for a moment. He looked at his son, still offering the carved animals. He looked at Simi. He looked at the walls of the home he had built here, at the simple solid life assembled around him piece by piece over years of quietly deciding, for the first time, to stay somewhere. He reached across and took her hand and held it. Later, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, he sat outside in the dark and did not sleep for a long time. He was not afraid. Fear was not the right word for what sat in his chest that night. It was closer to clarity, the particular sharpness that comes when what is at stake becomes completely undeniable. Every other time he had seen a disaster building and tried to stop it, he had been fighting for people he cared about. This time was different. This time he was fighting for the people he could not survive losing. By the time the first light began at the edge of the sky, he had made his decision. He told no one what he was doing for the first 3 days. He simply began moving, rising before the household woke, slipping out through the northern paths that led toward the borderlands the trader had mentioned, moving through the forest the way Sohn had taught him to move when observation mattered more than speed. Slowly, deliberately, becoming part of the landscape rather than a thing moving through it. He found the camp on the second day. It was larger than the trader's account had suggested. Much larger. They had positioned it in a wide clearing behind a ridge that made it invisible from the main roads. A competent choice that told him the commander had at least basic tactical sense. But the positioning also told him something more useful, that whoever had chosen this site was thinking about concealment from the road, not about concealment from the high ground above the ridge. Which meant nobody had gone up there to check whether the ridge itself could be observed from above. Dara went above the ridge. From that position, lying flat against the rock in the early morning light, he could see the entire camp. He counted methodically: soldiers, weapons, supply lines, the positions of the senior men, identifiable by where they slept and who moved around them, the guard rotation, the training patterns of the units, how they ate and in what order, which men the others watched when a decision needed to be made. He came back the following morning, and the morning after that, and for 2 weeks after that, never from the same approach twice, always from an angle the camp had not thought to watch. What assembled itself over those 2 weeks was a picture so complete it almost felt like reading a document someone had written specifically for him. The enemy force was formidable in the way that a very large stone is formidable, heavy, solid, capable of crushing whatever it fell on. Their numbers were significant. Their weapons were serious. Their physical conditioning was genuine. But they were a stone, and stones only move in one direction. They trained in the same formations every morning without variation, the same sequences, the same positions, the same responses to the same signals. An army that trains the same way every day is an army that will fight the same way every day, and an army that fights the same way every day can be studied until its next move is as predictable as sunrise. Their commander led every planning session himself and made every significant decision personally, which meant the army's intelligence lived in one man's head, and an army whose intelligence lives in one man's head stops thinking clearly the moment that man is confused or separated from his unit. They relied entirely on the shock of overwhelming force. Every strategy he observed them practicing was built on the same foundation. Hit hard, hit fast, hit from a direction the enemy is not watching, and trust that the size of what was coming would do the rest. It had worked for them before. It had probably worked many times. Against unprepared opponents with no walls and no warning, it would work again. Against an opponent who had been watching them for 2 weeks, it would not. Because their strength was also, precisely, their weakness. A force that has always won through overwhelming surprise has never had to develop a response for when the surprise fails. When the earth itself starts fighting back from directions they cannot locate, when their formations lose their shape because the ground beneath their feet is not what it appears to be, when the signal from the commander cannot restore order because the men cannot hear it over the chaos of something they have never trained for, that is the moment a large stone becomes simply a heavy thing falling in the wrong direction. Dara came back from his final morning at the ridge and went directly to the palace. King Obesai received him without making him wait. That was the first thing Dara noticed. Not a small thing, for a man who had twice requested audiences with kings and been made to understand through the waiting that whatever he had come to say was already being assessed as less important than the king's existing schedule. Obesai sat across from him at a low table with no advisors present, which meant either that he trusted Dara completely already or that he had been expecting this conversation. Dara suspected both were true. He laid it out the same way he had laid things out for the two kings before this one. Methodically, in sequence, without drama. The camp behind the ridge, the numbers. The supply lines that told him this was not a patrol or a border probe but a prepared offensive force. The pattern of their training that told him when they would move and from which direction. The commander's decision-making structure. The complete absence of any contingency planning in their exercises. Then he told Obesai the part he had not told the other kings, because the other kings had not given him time to get to it. He told him exactly how to win. Obesai listened to all of it without interrupting once. When Dara finished, the king was quiet for a moment, looking at the table between them, and Dara felt the familiar waiting. The breath before a king decided whether what he had just heard was wisdom or inconvenience. Then Obesai looked up. "Tell me what you need," he said. "For words. No qualification, no expression of doubt, no request for a second opinion. Simply tell me what you need." As if the only remaining question was logistical. Dara felt something release in his chest that had been held tight for a very long time. He needed three things. More men, every able-bodied man in Epha who could be trained in the weeks remaining before the attack. Full authority over the defensive preparations without committee or consensus slowing the decisions. And complete secrecy, not a word of what was coming to reach the general population of Epha. No panic, no visible change in the kingdom's daily rhythm. The village would continue exactly as it always had, because the enemy's plan depended on arriving to find exactly what they expected. A peaceful, undefended, completely unsuspecting kingdom going about its ordinary day. Obesai granted all three without negotiation. What followed was the most compressed period of work Dara had undertaken since the compound with Son. The young men he had been training in the mornings were the foundation. They already had discipline and basic formation knowledge, which meant he could use them immediately as the core of the larger unit he was now assembling. New recruits came in quickly once Obesai quietly made it known that Dara was building something and that the king had placed his full authority behind it. He trained them hard, and he trained them specifically, not general combat skills but the precise skills this particular defensive plan required. How to move through the forest at night without sound. How to hold a position absolutely still for hours. How to communicate through a system of signals that required no voice. How to set a trigger mechanism in the earth and cover it so completely that a man could walk across it without knowing it was there. The traps took the longest. They spent the weeks building them with the patience of a men who understood that the difference between a trap that works and a trap that fails is usually the difference between one careful hour and one careless minute. Dara mapped every approach path into Epha, the obvious ones and the hidden ones, especially the hidden ones, because that was where a force planning a surprise attack would come, and along each one he built layers. Not one line of defense, but three, each one different, each one designed to produce a specific response that would push the enemy into the next layer. Covered pits along the forest floor, their surfaces so carefully reconstructed that the earth above them looked undisturbed for weeks before the attack. Trip ropes strung at ankle height between trees, attached to mechanisms that released heavy rocks from positions above. Sharpened bamboo stakes beneath shallow sand at the points where a retreating man's feet would naturally fall. Archer positions in the elevated tree canopy at the precise angles that put the kill zones of every trap within range. They also began digging. The tunnel was the part of the plan that required the most people and the most time and the most absolute secrecy, because a tunnel large enough to shelter an entire population is not a small thing to hide. They dug at night, removing the earth in small amounts and distributing it across a wide area so no single location showed disturbed ground. The entrance was positioned inside a structure whose floor could be lifted and replaced without visible seam. The ventilation came through channels disguised as irrigation drainage. When the surface above it was complete, bamboo laid flat, palm fronds woven across, 2 inches of compacted sand on top. Dara walked across it himself 3 times from different angles. He could not tell it was there. Nobody spoke of it outside the men who built it. The women of Epha went to market. The farmers worked their fields. The children played in the square. The ceremonial guards leaned on their decorative spears at the gates. King Obasai moved through his kingdom with the same unhurried neighborly ease that had been the first thing Dara noticed about him. Epha looked exactly like what the enemy expected to find. The attack came on the morning Dara had predicted. He was already awake, already positioned, already watching the northern tree line when the first movement appeared in the pre-dawn dark. He had been awake most of the night, not from anxiety but from the particular focused calm of a man whose preparation is complete and whose variables have been reduced to as close to zero as human planning allows. He gave the signal. Along every prepared position, his men received it in silence and went still. The enemy came through the northern path first, their main force moving fast and quiet in the way of soldiers who have done this before and expect it to be finished quickly. They crossed the first line of traps without slowing because the traps were invisible and they had no reason to slow. The second line activated before the first had finished, and then the forest came alive from every direction at once. Pits opened beneath soldiers who had been moving confidently a half-step before. The rock mechanisms released, heavy stones rolling from elevated positions with a sound that filled the valley before the enemy had time to understand where it was coming from. Arrows from positions the enemy had never thought to look at. Above them, from angles that should have been tree canopy and turned out to be something else entirely. Bamboo stakes finding feet that had been placed without looking because there was no reason to look at ground that looked like ground. The formation, the rigid, practiced, unchanging formation that was everything this army knew how to be, dissolved in less time than it takes to explain it. Because a formation requires the men inside it to be able to see each other, respond to the commander's signals, and trust that the ground beneath their feet is what it appears to be. None of those conditions survived the first 2 minutes of contact with what Dara had built in those weeks of patient, precise, invisible preparation. The enemy commander tried to restore order. His signals went out. Some of his men heard them. The ones who could still move tried to respond. But responding to a formation signal requires knowing where the formation is, and the formation was no longer a formation. It was a collection of individuals in various states of crisis, each one dealing with a different piece of a trap network that seemed to be everywhere and come from nowhere. They retreated. Not an organized retreat, a dissolution. Men moving back the way they had come because forward had become incomprehensible and back was the only direction that still made sense. Through the northern path, back toward the ridge, back toward the camp behind it. They have lost half of their troops. Dara watched them go and did not move, because this was the part of the plan that the enemy did not know existed yet. While the first wave broke against the trap network, every woman, child, elder, and non-combatant in Epha had been moving through the tunnel entrance in careful, quiet sequence. Guided by the men Dara had assigned specifically to this task, moving without torches, without noise, into the underground space that could hold them all and had been stocked with water and food 3 days before the attack. By the time the enemy regrouped and came back, Epha was empty. Not abandoned, empty. Every home intact, every fire cold but recently kept. Every sign of a living community present except the living community itself. The enemy moved through the kingdom's streets in the silence of men who expected to find 10,000 things and found none of them. They began to search. And that was when the second network activated. The traps Dara had held back from the first line entirely, positioned not along the approach paths but inside the kingdom itself, in the streets and the square and the spaces between the buildings where searching soldiers naturally move. Smaller mechanisms, each one precise, each one placed at the exact point where a searching man's feet would go. From the surrounding positions, his soldiers closed in. What remained of the enemy force, already reduced, already disorganized, already in a kingdom that had swallowed their attack and given nothing back, now found itself compressed from every direction by men who knew exactly where they were and moved through the same space without stepping on a single thing they had placed there themselves. The remaining soldiers did not choose to fight. They ran. Through the northern path, back through the forest, past their own camp, beyond the ridge, and they kept running because the intelligence that had told them Epha was an undefended kingdom full of unsuspecting people had been so completely and so precisely wrong that nothing about their understanding of the situation could be trusted anymore. They had prepared for a sleeping village. They had found something that had been watching them for weeks. Dara stood at the northern tree line and watched the last of them disappear into the forest and felt the silence settle over Epha the way silence settles after a storm. Not empty but full, the full quiet of something that has passed. He walked back to the tunnel entrance and gave the signal. They came up into the morning light blinking, the children first, then the women, then the elders, emerging from the ground of their own kingdom into air that was still and calm and completely undisturbed, their village around them exactly as they had left it. Not a building burned, not a market stall overturned. Among Dara's soldiers, not a single man had fallen. Not one wound requiring treatment, not one family receiving news that would change them forever. The trap network had done what he designed it to do. Fought the battle before the battle could become a fight between people, turning the enemy's strength against itself so completely that by the time human contact might have been required, there was nobody left to make contact with. King Obasai came out of the tunnel behind his people, and the first thing he did was find Dara. He did not make a speech. He put both hands on Dara's shoulders and looked at him for a long time with the expression of a man who understands that some things cannot be adequately covered by words. Then he turned to his people gathered in the square of their unbroken kingdom and said simply that they owed this man everything, and that Epha would not forget it. The celebration lasted 3 days. Not a warrior celebration, a community celebration, the kind that happens when people who were genuinely afraid discover they are still alive and still whole and still together. Food shared across every household. Music in the square every evening. Children who did not fully understand what had been avoided running through the streets of a village that stood exactly as it always had. Dara sat at the edge of the celebration on the first evening with Simi beside him, their children asleep against them, and felt something he had not felt since before Kano. Not relief, not pride, but something quieter than both. The thing a man feels when he has finally done the thing he was built to do, in the place where it mattered most to him, for the people he could not have survived losing. Word of what happened at Epha traveled the way words travel in the ancient world, on the tongues of traders, in the accounts of soldiers who had survived the retreat and carried the story back to their own kingdoms, in the particular silence of military commanders in neighboring territories who received the reports and sat with them for a long time before speaking. An entire attacking force, significant in number, experienced, prepared, had been broken by a kingdom that nobody had previously considered a military threat. No history of warfare. A small population and a king known more for his generosity than his armies. They asked the question that military men always ask when the numbers do not explain the outcome. What had happened? The answer that came back was consistent across every account. They had never seen the defense, never located it, never found a single position to strike back against. The ground itself had fought them. The trees had fought them. The empty streets of an empty kingdom had fought them. And when they tried to understand the shape of what had defeated them, there was no shape to find, only the evidence of a mind that had studied them so completely and prepared so precisely against what it found, that the battle had effectively been over before it began. Nobody came back for Epha. Not that year. Not the year after. Not in any of the years that followed. Because the story that traveled with the retreating soldiers was not the story of a military force that had been defeated. Military forces were defeated all the time, and the kingdoms behind them sent another force and tried again. The story that traveled was something different. The story was about a man who had seen them before they arrived, who had read their plans from the ridge above their own camp, who had known the day they would come and the path they would use and the precise moment their formation would break. A man who did not need to match their strength because he had already found the place where their strength became useless. That story made neighboring kingdoms reconsider what attacking Epha would actually mean. It meant being studied, being understood, being prepared for in ways you could not anticipate because the preparation was built from your own patterns turned against you. Most kingdoms, given the choice, preferred to find a different target. Simi delivered safely, as Dara had fought for her to do. A girl this time, born into a kingdom at peace, into a home where her father sat by the fire in the evenings with the particular stillness of a man who has put down something heavy he had been carrying for a very long time. She would grow up in Epha knowing nothing of Kano, nothing of Gamba or Kasa or Burrow, nothing of the years her father spent walking between kingdoms looking for the thing he had finally found. She would know only the home she was born into, the people around her, the king who ruled with quiet generosity, the village that her father had once watched from a market stall and understood, in the same moment he recognized its vulnerability, that he was not going to be able to walk away from it. Dara watched his daughter in the first days of her life with the same attention he brought to everything, but without the analysis, without the cataloging of patterns and the assessment of implications. Just watching, the way a man watches something he is grateful to be present for. Today, the world knows Karnak as the most dangerous man in Marvel's Inhuman royal family, not because of any power granted to him by cosmic mist or alien biology, but because of what lives in his mind, the ability to look at anything, a person, a plan, an army, a kingdom, and find with absolute precision the exact point where it breaks. The world calls it a superpower, but the blueprint for that ability was never invented in a comic book writer's room. It lived in the ancient African tradition of the warrior scholar, men who understood that the greatest battles are won before they begin, that strength without strategy is simply weight, and that a mind trained to see clearly is more dangerous than any army trained to fight hard. Dara was not the only one. He was one of many men who wandered the ancient continent accumulating understanding the way other men accumulate weapons, who served and observed and moved on when what they served could not match what they knew, who finally found the place worth everything they had and defended it not with the force of their arms but with the precision of everything they had learned. He never needed terrigenesis. He never needed cosmic intervention or a ritual or a gift from any god. He needed a master willing to teach him to see. Years of living among people and understanding them more deeply than they understood themselves. The patience to watch and wait and prepare when every instinct said to act. And when the moment finally came, he was ready for it, in a way that left his enemies with nothing to fight back against, because the fight was over before they ever knew it had started. Karnak's creators gave him an ability and called it fiction. The real version walked ancient African earth, raised a family in a kingdom nobody considered worth defending, and left that kingdom standing so completely unbroken that nobody ever came back to try again. He just needed someone to finally tell his story. Now you have heard it.